I never wanted trouble. When I purchased my dream home on the outskirts of Pinewood Estates 3 years ago, I was ecstatic. The property was perfect. A charming 3-bedroom farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and most importantly, 5 acres of beautiful land that backed up to a protected wetland area. The selling agent mentioned there was an HOA, but assured me they were hands-off and mainly focused on the more densely populated part of the neighborhood. They just make sure nobody's painting their house neon pink or parking broken-down cars on their lawn, she had said with a laugh. The monthly fee was reasonable, and I figured it was worth it for the promise of maintained common areas and property values. For the first year, everything was peaceful. I kept my property in good shape, planted a small vegetable garden, and enjoyed watching deer graze in my back field during sunset. I even attended a few HOA meetings, where I met some friendly neighbors and our board members, including Diane Keller, the HOA president. Diane seemed pleasant enough at first, a middle-aged woman with an immaculate home and garden who volunteered for every community event. She greeted me warmly at meetings and complimented my landscaping when she walked by. I thought we might even become friends. That all changed when the HOA election season rolled around. The previous treasurer retired, and they needed someone with financial experience. With my background in accounting, I volunteered. I thought it would be a good way to get involved in the community. 2 weeks after I submitted my application, I received my first violation notice. According to the letter, my agricultural activities, my small vegetable garden, violated the HOA's landscaping guidelines. I was confused. Several neighbors had gardens, and no one had mentioned this in the year I've been growing tomatoes and zucchini. I called Diane to clarify, and her voice took on an edge I hadn't heard before. We're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic in Pinewood Estates, she explained coolly. Gardens should be confined to approved areas and shouldn't be visible from the street. It's in the bylaws. When I pointed out that my garden was behind my house and not visible from the street, she sighed. The guidelines are subject to interpretation by the board. You'll need to submit a landscaping plan for approval if you want to continue. As I hung up, I noticed a sleek black SUV driving slowly past my house. Behind the wheel was Diane, neck craned to get a better look at my property. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this was just the beginning. Part 2. Rules for thee, not for me. The garden violation was just the first salvo in what would become a barrage of HOA notices. Over the next 3 months, I received citations for everything from improper mailbox height, it was half an inch too short according to their measuring tape, to unauthorized wildlife feeding. I had a bird feeder. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine seemed to be higher than the last. When I attended the next HOA meeting to contest these charges, my application for the treasurer position was conspicuously absent from the agenda. We've decided to go with someone with more community experience, Diane announced when I asked. Her choice? Her next-door neighbor and walking buddy, Linda, whose financial experience consisted of selling makeup for a multi-level marketing company. I noticed a pattern forming. Homeowners who questioned Diane or the board received violation notices. Those who stayed quiet or were in Diane's social circle seemed immune to the HOA's scrutiny. Meanwhile, Diane's own violations, her oversized gazebo that exceeded the allowed dimensions, her non-approved fence extension, went completely ignored. The final straw came when I received a certified letter demanding I cease and desist all recreational and agricultural use of my backfield. According to the letter, several neighbors had complained about unsightly conditions. This is ridiculous, I said when I called Diane. My field is maintained, and it's my property. Actually, Diane replied with a smugness that made my blood boil. The HOA has easement rights for community improvement projects. If you read your contract carefully, you'll see that we can designate usage for common areas. My private field is not a common area, I argued. The board has voted and determined that your undeveloped land would better serve the community as overflow parking for our summer events. We'll be sending landscapers next week to begin preparations. When I told her she had no right to convert my private property, her tone turned icy. You can fight this and face continuing fines, or you can be a team player. Your choice, but I should remind you that HOA liens can lead to foreclosure. Think carefully about how you want to proceed." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence at my kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the field that had sold me on this property, the field where I'd planned to build a small barn someday, maybe get a couple of horses or goats. Now Diane wanted to turn it into a parking lot for the HOA's garden tours and wine tastings. I knew then that this wasn't about rules or community standards. This was about power, and Diane was drunk on it. Part 3. Know Your Enemy. I spent that night poring over my property documents, HOA bylaws, and county records. Something about Diane's claim didn't add up. The HOA did have certain easement rights, but they were specifically limited to utility access, not community improvement projects. There was nothing in my deed or the HOA covenant that gave them the right to commandeer 5 acres of my land. But Diane wasn't backing down. The next morning, I found survey stakes hammered into my field, marking out what appeared to be parking spaces. When I pulled them out, they reappeared the following day, along with a notice that I was interfering with HOA business. Another fine. I wasn't the only one feeling Diane's wrath. My neighbor Tom, a retired Marine who lived across the street, received violations for his American flag being oversized after he questioned the board's decision to raise dues by 15% with no explanation. Eleanor, an elderly woman who'd lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA existed, was cited for her non-conforming rose bushes that had been there for 20 years. We started meeting secretly. First just the 3 of us, then 5, then 12 homeowners, all sharing similar stories of Diane's selective enforcement and increasingly dictatorial management of the HOA. She's using HOA funds to renovate the clubhouse with her friend's interior design company, reported one neighbor who worked at the bank where the HOA kept its accounts. And they're planning to install a gate at the neighborhood entrance next year, with key cards that will cost each homeowner $200, added another who had connections on the architectural committee. But it was Tom who provided the most valuable insight. Follow the money, he advised. HOAs have to file financial reports. Let's request copies of everything. Bank statements, invoices, contractor bids. If she's abusing her position, there will be a paper trail. While the others began that process, I focused on my field issue. I hired a surveyor to confirm my property lines and consulted a real estate attorney. What we discovered sent a surge of adrenaline through me. According to these surveys, my attorney said, tapping the documents, the back portion of your field isn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction. It appears this land was incorrectly included in the HOA maps, but legally, it's outside their authority. But there was more. As the surveyor explained, this section here, about 2 acres, appears to be part of the wetland conservation easement. It's technically under the supervision of the State Environmental Protection Division. In other words, not only did the HOA have no right to my field, the part of it was actually protected government property where development was prohibited by law. As I was processing this information, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Landscapers just showed up at your property with bulldozers. Diane is with them. Part 4. Crossing the line, I broke every speed limit getting home. When I screeched into my driveway, I found 2 bulldozers idling at the edge of my field. A team of workers in high-visibility vests were taking measurements, and standing in the middle of it all was Diane, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a field marshal. "Stop," I shouted, running toward them. "This is private property. You have no permission to be here." Diane turned to me with a condescending smile. "We sent you multiple notices about the community improvement project. Work is commencing as scheduled." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police. You're trespassing." "Actually," she countered, producing a document from her clipboard. "As per Section 7 of the HOA covenant, we have the right to access common areas for maintenance and improvement. Your continued obstruction will result in additional fines." "This isn't a common area, and you know it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my rage. "I have surveys proving this land isn't even within HOA jurisdiction, and part of it is protected wetland." For a moment, Diane's mask slipped, and I saw uncertainty in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. "Our legal team has reviewed the situation. If you have concerns, you can bring them up at the next board meeting. The next meeting is 3 weeks away, and by then, you'll have destroyed my property." I turned to the construction foreman. "Did she show you permits for this work? Because you're about to bulldoze protected wetland, which is a federal offense." The foreman glanced at Diane. "Ma'am, you said all the permits were in order." "They are," she snapped, but I could see sweat beading at her temples despite the cool autumn air. "Continue with the work." That's when I played my trump card. "I've already contacted the Environmental Protection Division. They're sending an agent out immediately. Anyone participating in the unauthorized development of protected wetland could face fines up to $50,000 per day of violation." It was a bluff. I hadn't called them yet, but it worked. The construction workers began packing up their equipment, ignoring Diane's increasingly shrill objections. "You can't do this," she hissed at me when the workers were out of earshot. "The board has already approved the parking area. Contracts have been signed." "Contracts for work on land you don't control?" I asked. "That sounds like a serious legal problem for you, not me." Diane's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over. The HOA has ways of dealing with problem residents. By the time we're done with you, you'll wish you'd never moved here." As she stormed off to her SUV, my phone rang. It was my attorney. "I've been doing some digging," he said. "You need to call the State Environmental Protection Division right away. Not only is the HOA planning unauthorized development on protected land, but it appears they've been dumping lawn waste in the wetland area for years. Another major violation." As I ended the call, I watched Diane's SUV disappear down the street. Her threat echoed in my mind, and for the first time since this began, I felt a chill of genuine fear. This wasn't just about a parking lot anymore. This was war, and Diane had just brought bulldozers to a legal battle. Part 5. The paper trail after the bulldozer incident, the community began to fracture. Some neighbors, afraid of Diane's retaliation, distanced themselves from me. Others, emboldened by my stand, began their own rebellions, challenging fines, questioning expenditures, and demanding transparency at meetings. Diane's response was swift and ruthless. She called an emergency board meeting, scheduled in the middle of a workday when most homeowners couldn't attend, and pushed through a special assessment for legal fees that would cost each household $1,500. The message was clear: fight the HOA, and everyone pays. But while Diane was playing her public power games, I was building my case. My first step was filing a formal complaint with the State Environmental Protection Division, EPD. Within days, an environmental officer named Marcus Rodriguez arrived to inspect the wetland area. "This is definitely a Category 2 protected wetland," he confirmed, taking soil samples and photographs. "Any development here would require extensive environmental impact studies and multiple permits, none of which have been filed." When I showed him evidence of the HOA's yard waste dumping, his expression darkened. "That's a clear violation. We'll need to conduct a full investigation." Meanwhile, my attorney filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any HOA action on my property while the legal issues were sorted out. The judge granted it, citing substantial questions of property rights and environmental compliance. Tom and our growing coalition of neighbors were making progress on the financial front. By filing persistent records requests and leveraging a connection at the county clerk's office, we obtained 3 years of HOA financial documents, and what we found was explosive. Under Diane's leadership, the HOA had been systematically mismanaging funds. The landscaping company that maintained common areas was owned by her brother-in-law and charged 40% above market rates. The interior designer renovating the clubhouse was her college roommate, working without competitive bids. Most damning of all, we discovered that Diane had been reimbursing herself thousands of dollars in vague administrative expenses, with no receipts or board approval. "This isn't just bad management," my attorney explained as we reviewed the documents. "This is potential fraud, but our most valuable ally came from an unexpected source. Linda, Diane's hand-picked treasurer, reached out to me privately. She was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder when we met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. I didn't know what I was getting into," she confessed, sliding a USB drive across the table. Diane said the treasurer position was just signing checks she approved. But I've seen things that don't add up, and when I asked questions, she threatened to reveal some personal information about my family that could hurt my husband's business. The drive contained copies of emails between Diane and various board members discussing how to make examples of homeowners who challenge their authority, explicitly targeting those with the means to move if necessary. There were detailed plans for using HOA reserves to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on problem residents, with my name at the top of the list. Most importantly, there was a proposal from a developer, a cousin of Diane's, outlining plans for the community parking area on my field. The real agenda wasn't just a parking lot. It was a commercial event space they planned to rent out for weddings and parties, with a kickback scheme that would funnel profits to Diane and select board members. Armed with this evidence, I filed complaints with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division and the County Prosecutor's Office. The local news, always hungry for stories of corruption, jumped on the case. A reporter showed up at the next HOA meeting, asking pointed questions about financial discrepancies and environmental violations. Diane, always composed in public, finally showed her true colors. "This is private HOA business," she snapped at the reporter. "These allegations are being made by a disgruntled homeowner who refuses to comply with community standards." As if on cue, the door opened, and in walked Marcus Rodriguez from the EPD, accompanied by 2 officers from the county sheriff's department. "Diane Keller," Marcus asked, "we have some questions about unauthorized activities in a protected wetland area, and the officers have a warrant regarding potential financial improprieties." The color drained from Diane's face as she realized her carefully constructed kingdom was beginning to crumble. Part 6. The House of Cards. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity that sent shockwaves through Pinewood Estates. The county prosecutor's office launched a formal investigation into the HOA's finances, freezing their accounts and suspending their authority to collect dues or issue fines while the probe was underway. The environmental case moved even faster. The EPD issued multiple citations for wetland violations, with potential fines totaling over $200,000. They ordered an immediate halt to all development plans near the protected area and mandated a comprehensive remediation plan for the years of yard waste dumping. Diane's response was predictable. She blamed everyone but herself. According to her, the financial irregularities were honest mistakes by the previous treasurer. The wetland violations were due to outdated maps that didn't properly mark the protected areas, and the kickback scheme detailed in the emails, taken out of context, she insisted, but her support was evaporating. 3 board members resigned immediately after the investigation became public, not wanting to be associated with the growing scandal. Linda turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about how Diane had manipulated the HOA's finances and bullied board members into compliance. Most satisfying was watching Diane's social circle abandon her one by one. The same neighbors who had benefited from her selective enforcement, who had looked the other way while she targeted others, suddenly couldn't recall their close friendship when reporters came calling. The Elvaways Insurance Company dropped another bombshell when they announced they were denying coverage for the legal defense of board members, citing intentional acts outside the scope of HOA authority as grounds for exclusion. This meant Diane and her remaining allies would be personally responsible for legal fees and any judgments against them. At an emergency community meeting called by homeowners, not the board, over 85% of residents voted to recall Diane and the remaining board members. The atmosphere was charged. Years of resentment poured out as homeowner after homeowner stood to share stories of intimidation, arbitrary rule enforcement, and financial strong-arming. She threatened to lien my house because my Christmas lights stayed up 3 days past the January 2nd deadline, while her own decorations were up until February. One homeowner testified, "My mother was cited for unauthorized occupancy when she came to help after my surgery. She's my mother, not a tenant." Another added, "When it was my turn to speak, I didn't focus on my field or the planned parking lot. Instead, I presented evidence of how Diane had systematically turned neighbor against neighbor, creating a culture of fear while enriching herself and her cronies. An HOA should protect our community and property values, not become a weapon for personal vendettas or a slush fund for insiders. I concluded, we have the power to reclaim our neighborhood. The vote wasn't even close. Diane and her allies were removed, and an interim board was elected to work with authorities during the investigation. As we were leaving the meeting, I overheard Diane on her phone in the parking lot. They can't do this to me, she was saying, her voice cracking. I built this community. Without me, it will fall apart. For the first time, I felt a twinge of pity for her. Diane's identity was so wrapped up in controlling others that she couldn't see how her actions had destroyed the very community she claimed to care about. But my pity vanished the next morning when I found my mailbox smashed and a note taped to the splintered post. This isn't over. Part 7. Justice served. The criminal investigation into the HOA's finances moved with glacial slowness, but the civil and environmental cases accelerated. My attorney filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Diane personally for attempted conversion of property, harassment, and abuse of position, seeking damages and permanent injunctive relief. Diane, now facing mounting legal bills without the HOA's resources behind her, hired an aggressive attorney who specialized in scorched earth tactics. They filed countersuits against me for defamation, tortious interference with business relationships, and a dozen other frivolous claims designed to drain my resources and will to fight. This is standard procedure, my attorney assured me. They're hoping you'll get exhausted and settle. They don't realize who they're dealing with. He was right. Each attack only strengthened my resolve. I'd already come too far to back down now. The turning point came 4 months into the legal battle, when the judge granted our motion for summary judgment on the property issue. The ruling was unequivocal. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my field, and approximately 2 acres were indeed protected wetland under state and federal law. More importantly, the judge referred Diane's attorney to the State Bar Association for filing knowingly false claims, after evidence showed that Diane had been informed by the HOA's previous attorney that her claims to my property were legally unsupportable, yet she had proceeded anyway. With the property issue settled, the focus shifted to the financial investigation. The forensic accountants hired by the prosecutor's office had followed the money trail back 5 years and uncovered a pattern of self-dealing that went beyond even what we had discovered. Diane had been using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, skimming from contracts, inflating reimbursements, and even creating a shell company that supposedly provided administrative services to the association, services that were never actually rendered. The case made local headlines when the prosecutor announced charges against Diane for embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. The total amount allegedly stolen over 5 years exceeded $350,000, money that should have gone to community improvements or been kept in reserves for emergencies. The day of Diane's arraignment, I sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the once proud HOA president shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit, handcuffs around her wrists. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her power and clipboard. When she spotted me, her eyes narrowed with hatred. But beneath the anger, I could see fear, the same fear she had instilled in so many homeowners who had dared to challenge her authority. The environmental case reached its conclusion the following week, with the EPD issuing its final assessment, $275,000 in fines for wetland violations, plus mandatory remediation costs estimated at another $120,000. Because the current HOA members shouldn't bear the full burden of previous leadership's actions, the judge ruled that Diane and the former board members would be personally liable for 70% of the penalties. During this time, my field had become something of a cause célèbre in environmental circles. A local conservation group offered to help restore the wetland portion to its natural state, creating a small wildlife sanctuary that would serve as both an environmental buffer and an educational resource for the community. At a community meeting, I proposed donating the restored wetland area to a land trust to ensure its permanent protection, while maintaining hiking trails that all residents could enjoy. The proposal passed unanimously, a far cry from the parking lot Diane had envisioned. As we were finalizing these plans, I received an unexpected visitor, the county prosecutor. "We've been following the money," he explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table, and we found something interesting. The developer who was going to build the event space on your property. He's been involved in similar schemes in 3 other counties, always partnering with HOA insiders. He pointed to bank records showing transfers between the developer's company and an offshore account. We believe this is part of a larger pattern of corruption. Your case helped us connect the dots. The implication was clear. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had uncovered a significant criminal enterprise. By standing my ground over a field, I had inadvertently pulled on a thread that was now unraveling a sweater of corruption that extended far beyond Pinewood Estates. As the prosecutor was leaving, he paused at the door. By the way, Diane's taken a plea deal. She's cooperating in exchange for reduced charges. Thought you'd want to know. I walked out onto my porch after he left, looking out over my field as the setting sun painted the tall grasses golden. In the distance, a family of deer emerged from the tree line, cautiously making their way across the land that would now remain their home, not a parking lot. Despite everything, I felt no triumph, only relief that justice had finally been served, and that both my property and our community could begin to heal. Part 8. Rebirth and Reflection. 1 year after Diane's arrest, Pinewood Estates was a different place. The new HOA board, elected in a genuine democratic process with record turnout, had revised the bylaws to include strict transparency requirements, term limits, and checks on board power. All financial records were now published monthly, and major expenditures required homeowner approval. The wetland restoration project had transformed the back portion of my field into a thriving ecosystem. Native plants replaced invasive species, and wooden boardwalks allowed residents to enjoy the area without disturbing sensitive habitat. Bird-watching platforms and educational plaques made it a neighborhood attraction, with local schools organizing field trips to learn about wetland ecology. As for Diane, she served 8 months in minimum security prison before being released on probation. As part of her plea agreement, she was prohibited from serving on any HOA board or managing any community association. She sold her house in Pinewood Estates and moved away. Rumor had it she relocated to a condominium with no HOA, the remaining portion of my field, the part that was truly my private property. I eventually turned into a small community garden, with plots available to any neighbor who wanted to grow vegetables or flowers. Ironically, this fulfilled my original vision for the land, albeit with more participants than I'd initially planned. On a warm Saturday in spring, as we celebrated the garden's opening day with a neighborhood potluck, Tom approached me with a beer in hand. "You know, if Diane hadn't tried to take your field, none of this would have happened," he observed, gesturing to the families planting seedlings in freshly tilled soil. "Sometimes the worst intentions lead to the best outcomes." I nodded, watching Eleanor teaching a group of children how to transplant tomato seedlings. At 80, she had become our resident gardening expert, her formerly non-conforming roses now proudly displayed as heritage varieties. "The craziest part," I said, "is that if Diane had just asked instead of demanded, I probably would have allowed occasional parking on the front section for special events. It was her need to control everything that ultimately cost her everything." After Tom wandered off to help with the grilling, I took a walk along the wetland boardwalk. A small plaque had been installed at the entrance, dedicated to community preservation and environmental stewardship. Below those words, in smaller type, was a quote that the new board had selected: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." As I stood there, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Turning, I saw a familiar black SUV slowing as it passed my property. For a moment, I thought it was Diane coming back for one last look at the kingdom she'd lost. But it was just a new neighbor, curious about the community gathering. I waved, and they waved back. A simple gesture of the mutual respect that now defined our neighborhood. That evening, as the last guests departed, and I sat alone on my porch watching fireflies rise from the field, I reflected on the strange journey of the past 2 years. I had bought this house seeking peace and privacy, only to be thrust into a battle I never wanted. In fighting for my property, I had become more connected to my community than I ever expected to be. The field that Diane had tried to turn into a parking lot had instead become a symbol of resilience, both environmental and human. The land had recovered from years of abuse, just as our neighborhood had recovered from years of tyranny. As darkness fell completely, I could make out the silhouette of deer grazing in the distance, reclaiming their territory without fear. In nature as in neighborhoods, I thought, balance eventually reasserts itself. Sometimes it just needs a little help from those willing to stand their ground. When I finally went inside, I noticed a letter had been slipped under my door, an invitation to run for the HOA board in the upcoming election. I smiled as I set it aside. Maybe someday, but for now, I was content to be simply a homeowner, tending my garden and watching the seasons change across a field that remained wild and free, exactly as it was meant to be.